check in with my pal Hank South. Does an outstanding job covering recruiting for us there at BOL. Hank, welcome back to the show.
What's going on, Travis?
You know it, man. We're just trying to make some radio here. It's a struggle at times, but we get through it, even with me hosting this thing. Hey, it was thought to be kind of just your run-of-the-mill, late in the process official visit weekend, I guess, going into last Friday. But things picked up with the word of an uncommitted four-star defensive lineman from the state of Mississippi unofficially showing up in Tuscaloosa. Talk a little bit about how that came to be with McKinley Jackson, who, if he isn't at the top of the targets still out there for this Alabama staff in the 2020 cycle, he's right there with the top one or two. Right.
Yeah, not to discount the commitments and signees taking their official visits with Kyle Edwards and Javon Baker in town, but adding McKinley Jackson to that visitors list late probably was the biggest development of the weekend. And if you've been following this, it's not really a huge surprise. McKinley himself has actually been saying since December that he wanted to get back to Alabama in the month of January. When we caught up with him at the All-American Bowl, he was saying the same thing, that he was planning to get back. He just didn't know when. Of course, he took his official visit in September, so he's already used that. So anything he takes further to Alabama would just be an unofficial. But Alabama was able to get him in on campus on Saturday. He actually decided to spend the night in Tuscaloosa, and he left on Sunday. So he spent a good bit of time with the staff, just kind of reconnecting. Obviously, they're very close. Bama was in to see him on Friday. Pete Golding and Brian Baker were out at his school, one of their first stops of the contact period after the dead period lifted. So, it's been in the making for a while, and it's a really significant time to get him back on campus with upcoming visits to LSU and Texas A&M to close out his recruitment. And obviously, Nick Saban will be in home to see him later this week as well. So, getting him back on campus, kind of getting him, he's been so many times to Tuscaloosa, but now it's probably the most important time of his recruitment to kind of get back face-to-face with him, get him back on campus, and, just keep the momentum Bama's built with him throughout the recruitment going.
Like a lot of guys, it seems like in this cycle especially, and certainly recruiting momentum or perceived momentum in some instances goes hand in hand with team success. And LSU has been that team for the most part over the last 3 or 4 months with the incredible run that the Tigers went on in the 2019 season. And it seemed like, anyway, kind of on the outside where I watch it, that was the case with McKinley Jackson. Was that ever really the case, Hank, or do you still consider LSU a real prime threat to Alabama in all this? How has that changed, or has it changed at all throughout the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, I think LSU is still a threat to Alabama. Obviously, we saw the wave of staff turnover they had in the last week with Dave Aranda taking the Baylor job, and obviously Joe Brady, which doesn't really involve McKinley Jackson, but he was actually, a lot of people forget about this, he was committed to LSU very early on in his recruitment, and so he has ties to the program. He has close relationships with the staff and thinks very highly of them. So I still consider them a threat. I think, that if you're really looking at this, it's more of a 3-team race with Alabama, LSU, and Texas A&M, which are going to be the last schools to get them on campus. Auburn's in the mix as well, too, but, I think it's more of those 3 aforementioned teams. So, we'll see how much of an impact that plays. I think LSU obviously is going to try to, reestablish their relationship with him this weekend and kind of, get them familiar with whoever they have, coming in to take over on their staff. And then obviously A&M is going to try to keep, the momentum they have, because there have been some that have felt A&M is the stiffest competition to Alabama in the race for McKinley Jackson's signature. So I think a lot is still going to be determined here the next couple of weeks, as he takes these last few visits and hosts these head coaches for the final in-homes.
Of the committed players who did not sign with Alabama in December, I know Javon Baker was on campus. He qualifies as one of those commitments, the wide receiver from Powder Springs, Georgia. What's the status with those guys as it sits right now? And And how much could things change over the next week or so? I know it's another official visit weekend coming up, and in addition to McKinley Jackson, there are some other prime targets that are out there, whether they be committed elsewhere or uncommitted altogether. What does that scenario kind of shape up with when you combine all those factors?
Yeah, I still, with 2 weeks, it's so close to signing day, but there is still kind of a handful of things up in the air. Obviously, the guys that didn't sign, Javon Baker, Jamil Burroughs from Georgia, those are two guys that are both, working on clearing some academic hurdles. They were, working on prior to the early signing period that kept them from signing early. They're still working towards that. Obviously, both guys are still very firmly committed. Javon Baker may take an official visit to Arkansas this weekend. I don't foresee him changing his mind on Alabama unless something were to happen. With that academic stuff, I think that would be the only way we'd see him exit the class or just not sign with Alabama on February 5th. Jason Jones, that's going to be an interesting one. We're still tracking. He was at Baylor this past weekend. Dave Aranda's first official visit weekend, they had him out. He's expected at Oregon this weekend. We've talked about how he wants to play defensive line. Alabama's kind of shifted their efforts with him to the offensive line. I think, the only way we see him stick with the 2020 class is if he does, opt to take a blue shirt, which we've talked about a few times. And obviously that would count him towards next year's class. So that's kind of a situation we're watching kind of unfold the next couple of weeks, see how that ends up. And then Damian George, he says he didn't sign early. I think, we'll see what happens with that. I think he's firmly committed. I don't foresee him changing his mind off of Alabama. He talked about taking visits elsewhere, but I don't think that's going to happen. But as far as kind of the outlook towards the next two visitor weekends, this upcoming weekend, Bama is expected to host Ennis Rakestraw, the rising cornerback from Texas that's been just blowing up on the recruiting circuit. He was at Mizzou this past weekend, and it'll be Georgia the final weekend. So kind of a significant time for Ennis Rakestraw. And then the final weekend, they'll have a junior day. So we'll see him get another official visitor or two on campus. Nothing is set at this point, but the junior day is always something they do right before signing day, and it kind of gives you a preview of kind of what they're working towards the next cycle.
Hank, as we know, there on the roundtable at BamaOnline.com in the last 18 hours or so, some strong rumblings of a potential coaching move there with the strong possibility of Freddie Roach, former Alabama player support staffer, played under Dennis Franchione and also Mike Shula before working in a support staff role under Nick Saban. The rumblings that he could be headed back to Tuscaloosa, perhaps as the defensive line coach. What would be, or would there be, an immediate benefit for Alabama from a recruiting perspective should it play out that way? In other words, can Freddie Roach, if he is in fact the guy that comes in here, can he help even at this late in the game with a guy like a McKinley Jackson on that defensive line?
Yeah, absolutely. I think McKinley Jackson is the one name you look at that it would benefit the most with. Obviously, McKinley being a Mississippi guy, that was who he was closest with on the Ole Miss staff. In fact, that might be one of the main reasons Ole Miss made it as far in his recruitment as they did. He was close to Matt Luke, obviously, too, but Freddie Roach was a big part of his recruitment. And so should that happen, as it looks like it's expected to happen, I think that would pay huge dividends in terms of, kind of where Alabama stands with McKinley Jackson. I think they already stood very high for him with the relationships he has and, the admiration he has for Nick Saban and the program in Tuscaloosa. So I think you look at that as kind of the biggest immediate impact. And then, you kind of look at his whole recruiting background as a whole. He's been in Ole Miss the last few cycles, and obviously at Ole Miss it's probably not the easiest of times to recruit elite level targets, but he's gotten some guys. He's recruited very well for Ole Miss in the state of Alabama, Southern Mississippi. So he's got a lot of inroads in those areas that I think having the brand of Alabama behind him, should he opt to come to Alabama, I think that would we'd see him, I think, quickly emerge into one of the better recruiters on the staff.
There you go, Hank South. All the great coverage available for you right now at BamaOnline.com. Check it out today. Hey, Hank, we appreciate it as always.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Travis.